fertility, in this case assets and so on, mostly from an economics perspective, but lately you've been doing some participant observation, right? You're actually, and you're just back from...
I do stuff both in the field and in the lab, but I'm returning from maternity leave.
Right, there you go. That's where I was heading with that one. Anyhow, so she's been here. She knows the drill, and all the time is yours. So
great, thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. So since Herb kind of introduced me and talked a little bit about my other research, I won't go too much into that, but I just wanted to sort of explain the perspective that I bring to these topics, because a lot of the topics I work on, people are like, oh, that sort of sounds like sociology, or that sounds like demography, right? And I do work on these topics, but I work on them using economic models. And so the way that I try to approach issues of gender and family economics is I try to approach them the way we approach other problems in economics, which is that, it's about agents maximizing subject to constraints. And so I just treat women as economic agents and say, what is the maximization problem that they're solving, and what are the constraints? And that might be why we're sometimes sort of seeing different outcomes for women, or there are gendered components in the labor market, but it might be coming from that underlying optimization problem rather than saying, there's some sort of difference in preferences or in abilities. And so a lot of my research focuses on something called reproductive capital, which is that I look at what is the economic value of fertility and how should we conceive of fertility, which is something that obviously produces enormous economic value. I like to make the joke that not everybody consumes cars, but almost everybody consumes children. So almost everybody wants to have children. Get it? Consumes? No? Okay. You don't eat children, but almost everybody wants to have children. So this is obviously something that has enormous economic value. The same way economists want to study, when you go to the grocery store, what things are you going to purchase and why? People are choosing to, consume children. You can throw my stuff off of that, Andrew, and use that chair. And this must be something that's valuable to them. And women produce it, and therefore women are producing something of economic value. And so we should try to understand that within an economic model. And so I'm going to kind of approach marriage that same way today, where I'm going to try to understand what is the economic value of the marriage contract. So what does marriage as a contract enable? The same way, like labor market contracts enable some kind of economic value to be produced. It enables a worker to go to a firm and go make widgets, right? The marriage contract must be producing something of value. And I'm going to try to use that lens to understand why we've seen that marriage has changed a lot over the past 50 years. So marriage is something that in society used to be practically universal, and that maybe not everybody did it, but everybody wanted to do it, right? Whereas today, we see that there's just been this tremendous shift in that marriage is not the sort of universally aspired to thing that it once was. We see throughout the world falling marriage rates, and in the US, we see a growing stratification in socioeconomic groups, by education, by income, and by race on who gets married and who doesn't. And so in this paper, we wanted to understand, why is marriage less attractive than it was previously? But more importantly, perhaps, why has it been able to retain value for some people, because some people persist in getting married, while it seems to have lost value for other people? So what is this economic contract that's happening, and why is it only valuable to some people today? And you might ask, okay, why is that even a question? Obviously, there's lots of things you get out of marriage, right? Well, I would push back to say, well, how many of those things can you not just get from cohabitation, right? You can capture the returns to scale if it's more convenient to live together with somebody. You can, have a relationship where you really love somebody and you enjoy spending time with them and just live together, right? And we know that you can actually have a child without being married. So, there's all those things that you might think, oh, you really get these out of marriage. It's not actually so clear that you need marriage, the marriage contract, in order to get them, right? And I know that, there are probably some benefits as far as, survivorship benefits and inheritance and things like that. But all of those things, you can actually write alternative contracts to have those benefits. You don't actually need the marriage contract for those things, right? And as there's been some legal changes in the US, which I'm going to go into more in a little bit, cohabitation has actually gotten even more similar to marriage, because it used to be that the only way that a father had both rights over a child and responsibilities to a child was through the marriage contract. The father was by definition the husband of the mother. So the marriage contract is actually what gave the father those rights, right? But now in the US, there's these paternity establishment laws where a father has both rights and responsibilities without the marriage contract. So what we're going to explore today is something that people haven't looked at, is that as cohabitation and marriage have become more similar, there's one really important way in which they have maintained being different, and that is the treatment of assets in case a relationship dissolves. Only through marriage, in the US, only through marriage do both parties have claim on any assets that were acquired during the marriage, okay? So that means that if you are married to somebody and you go out and buy a car, okay, that is a joint asset because you are married, and part of the marriage contract is that whatever is coming in is actually shared property. It's not, even if you went and bought it with the money from your paycheck, it's joint marital property. That is not the case in cohabitation. So in the US, no matter how long you live together, no matter how many children you have together, okay, if you are to break up and you're not married, you have no claim on each other's assets, right? That's not true for income because there's child support, right? But for assets, that's true. So this difference between the marriage contract and the next best thing of kind of having children through cohabitation has not been explored at all in previous literature, and we're gonna propose a model and make an argument where that is actually the key explanatory factor for why some people still get married today and other people don't. And the idea is that investing in children requires some time, some costs, some risks, okay? And for one partner to be willing to do that, they need to know that they're going to be taken care of in case the relationship goes south, okay? The marriage contract previously offered a lot of security for that kind of like risky investment, right? But as that contract has become much less so secure, now, only if you can actually own property, you're wealthy enough to own property, can you offer that security, because the husbands can ante up the marital home, and that's why we call it betting the house, to secure the marriage contract, to basically say, look, because we own property, you're guaranteed that you're going to get something over and above what you would get through cohabitation if the relationship goes south. And that's going to allow the couple to make more optimal investments in children, even if one person has to pay the costs, well, somebody else gets to enjoy the benefits because the contract is going to be more secure, okay? So in essence, I am saying that child investments are a mortgage-backed security because the woman is willing to invest in children's human capital because she has this security of knowing that if there's a house there, she's going to have something to fall back on. So to kind of just get into this idea of child investments, basically, it's sort of well known that children who are born to married parents get more investments than children who are born to unmarried parents, right? But you might think that that's just selection because we know that higher socioeconomic groups tend to get married more, okay? Our model is going to suggest that yes, there's a selection element to it, but actually a big part of it comes from the strength of the marriage contract itself. That the marriage contract is very effective at actually enabling child investments through creating this extra security. Why do you need security? Well, investing in children is costly. It's asymmetrically costly for women versus men, and so I'm going to use gendered language throughout this talk, and let me just sort of explain why. So just coming back from maternity leave myself, I know that there are just some parts of having a child that are very difficult to share with a male partner, no matter how much you might want to, right? So pregnancy, birth, breastfeeding, right? These are all costs that the woman has to take on. If you want to, just make an argument based on what we see in the data, if you look at the American Time Use Survey, women are doing much more than that. Women are continuing to make disproportionate investments once the child sort of is older, right? If you want to make an economic argument, you could say, well, once she provides those investments that just can't be shared, there might be dynamic complementarities where then it's cheaper for her to provide these additional investments later on as the child gets older. And then another way we can tell that it's more costly for women is we can look at the wage data, and there's been a lot of research that shows that when the big divergence in women's and men's wages happen is after women have children. So if you look at places where there's not a lot of labor market discrimination, like Scandinavia, you actually see that men's and women's wages are pretty parallel until the first child happens, and that's when women's wages really go down. So investing in children, having children appears to be something that's costly for women. And it's shared, the benefits are shared by both the husband and the wife. So that's what in economics we call a public goods problem, which is that, she has to pay the cost. The costs are largely private, but the benefits are shared, okay? So that means, marriage used to kind of ensure that she was going to be rewarded for this, right? That she was going to reap some benefits and be able to share the cost with her partner. But as marriage has become more precarious, because divorce has become easier and much more common, that assurance that she had that if she took this risk, made these investments, it was going to be paid back, has disappeared. However, high asset individuals are still able to offer some assurance through this idea of shared assets upon divorce, that those assets are going to be divided. So this is very consistent with a new paper by two people who have a long history of working in this area, Shelley Lundberg and Bob Pollack, that argue that the reason we see an uneven retreat from marriage is that marriage is useful as a framework for investing in child human capital. And so the people who want to invest heavily in child human capital still get married, and the people who don't want to invest don't get married. And that right there is the power of what I'm going to present today, because what I'm going to present is going to give you a framework where the difference doesn't have to be whether people want to invest in children. We're going to assume that everybody would love to invest in their children, right? But the issue is the ability to secure that investment via this wealth channel, okay? So we're going to create an underlying economic reason why you might see this stratification throughout society without having to say that people have fundamentally different preferences, and some people just really like sending their kids to college and other people not so much, okay? So just to give you some suggestive empirical evidence, and then to give you an overview of what I'm going to do today, I'm going to spend a lot of time on an economic model, and then I'm going to show you some empirics at the end. But just to kind of show you that there's a suggestion that this is true, my co-author and I have a paper in the AER Papers and Proceedings where we document that even if you condition on a whole host of factors that people say are what drive marriage, race, income, education, assets still have a huge explanatory power in determining who gets married. So conditional on income, within an income bracket, within a race, within an education bracket, if you have more assets, you're much more likely to get married, okay? And so we think that assets there's something about assets kind of over and beyond these other issues. This data is from the SIP. And we're going to be focusing on homeownership as a crucial asset. And the reason for that is that homeownership, like the marital home, is just one. It's sort of the main asset that most people have. If you look at the American middle class, that's 66% of all wealth is held in, the family home. It's also something that I know, no matter what the regime, the divorce regime is going to be divided upon divorce, or in fact, just given to the wife, okay? So even if you look at community property states or separate property states or equitable division states, the family home is always treated as something that the woman has some claim on. She's more often given child custody, so she's also more often given the family home. So she might even be sort of awarded the whole family home. And so that means in some of our empirics, you're going to see that we're going to define who has assets and who doesn't by even looking at premarital assets, because that's how I'm going to be able to look prospectively and say that holding assets at the beginning makes you more likely to get married, okay? Why would I look at premarital assets when technically those aren't subject to this division in divorce? The reason is somebody who has premarital assets is going to be able to put down that down payment and acquire the family home, and is going to be able to have that asset that's going to be divided upon divorce. Because that's what most people do with that little bit of an inheritance that they have in their bank account. That's not going to be subject to division upon divorce, but as soon as they put it on a down payment, then every subsequent mortgage payment is subject to that division upon divorce. And so some people wonder, like, why do so many people own homes? It seems sort of inconvenient, and it's a super illiquid asset. America's really over-invested in homes. Our research today actually suggests that the illiquidity and the inconvenience of it is actually a feature, not a bug, because people want to have this really stable asset to guarantee the wife that she's going to have some economic security in case the relationship dissolves. So just one more piece of suggestive evidence is that this is again using the SIP using this longitudinal data set, and what I do is I look at people who get married at time 0 versus just like a control group, a counterfactual group that I construct of people who don't get married during that same period, and you just see how intimately connected marriage and homeownership is. On the y-axis is homeownership, where right after people get married, they start acquiring homes, and we go from a homeownership rate of 25% to 50% within 3 years of marriage. And I've done the same thing for having children. So you might be like, oh, maybe it's because they have children, that's why they go and acquire homes, and it's not the case. So when people have children, they do not go through this rapid home acquisition process. It's really tied to getting married. And why the argument that we're making is because we're saying the contract of marriage isn't as good as it used to be unless you have a home to go with it. So if you're gonna get married and you want the full value of the contract, you also need the home so the contract is secured, the contract is collateralized, because without it, legally the contract has been so weakened by these legal changes that you're not gonna get the juice out of the marital contract. Okay. So I'm going to now present a model, so forgive me the people who aren't economists and don't like looking at utility functions and stuff like that, but I'm going to tell you all as we go along what the intuition is for the results. So the model is just going to show you why having a home is going to not only increase child investments, but then also increase the value of marriage and make people want to get married more. Yeah?
What is the model for?
What is the what?
What is the model for?
So, do you believe me right now that if you have a joint asset, that it's going to make you more likely to get married? I think it's intuitive, but it's not obvious theoretically.
You're saying that I don't believe English? Math? To say an equation, what you just said, that's the reason.
So I want to show you the channel because I think it's interesting. So the idea is that I have to first show you that investment in children is if you want that proof, the lemmas of that proof are that you have to believe that investment in children is too low, lower than the social optimum in the absence of having a joint marital home. And then if you have a home, it's going to raise child investment. That means it's going to raise the value of marriage, and therefore more people are going to get married. So you need that piece of it.
Yes, you're going to just put an equation, but you just said it works.
Yeah, but they're such pretty equations, Victor. Give them a chance. No, and I think you're going to see the model is something I can completely explain in words, and I summarized it in the beginning. But it is something that, I'm going to be able to do some simulations with the model, and it's going to allow me to do some fun things, but the model is completely intuitive. Okay, so I'm going to set up a model of marriage where individuals live for 2 periods, and they're going to have an endowment, which you should think of as their income level, because this what the key thing is about this model is that people just say, oh, it's an income difference. And so that's why I'm building into the model, we're going to have income differences, and I'm going to show you it's assets that matter, right? The income difference is going to give you some of the juice, but it's assets that are really going to make the difference. So this endowment thing is I'm going to have people of all different incomes, and then I'm going to have people with and without assets. And here I'm just giving the assets to the men because that's where they're going to matter in terms of being able to collateralize this marriage contract, right? Women could also have assets, but they're going to be a little bit irrelevant here because women aren't the ones who are trying to induce this investment in public goods from their partners.
But when you say asset, it's the individual asset, right? Not the parent asset. Am I right? So like endowment can include some of your parents' asset. In other words, we don't inherit the house now, but when I get to the point when I get married, I can get my parents' house. I mean, some. So
the key thing for the asset is that the way we're setting it up is the asset is something that can be divided upon divorce, okay? The endowment is something that you can put into children, and so if your parents are willing to pay for your child's private school, then that can be part of your endowment. The asset has to be something that can be divided upon divorce. So if your parents buy you a house to live in, but they paid the mortgage in full, that doesn't count. If they give you the down payment, it does count, because then you're paying the mortgage payments and acquiring equity that can be divided upon divorce. So that's.
But when you get married, though, I mean, try to select your partner, you don't look at only his asset, but sometimes you look at his parents' asset. You know what I'm saying? So
what I'm going to say, in this reductive world where this is how we get married, I'm going to say what you're looking for is, are you able to acquire us a house or not? So if your parents are going to pay our down payment, fabulous, because that means we're going to have a property. So after I get finished investing in our children for 10 years, I'm guaranteed that that's 10 years of equity we've been building up in a house, right? So I think that's fine. You care about it, but it's about going towards the down payment on the house. Okay, so individuals can choose between being single, doing non-marital fertility, or getting married. And in both cases with non-marital fertility or getting married, you're going to have children, you're going to enjoy them for 2 periods, but you're just going to invest in them in the first period. And let's talk about sort of what the utility function looks like. So we're going to have quasi-linear utility. So it's going to be linear in child quality, which you're going to enjoy for 2 periods, but it can be concave in consumption, okay? So singles just are going to eat their endowment, so they're just going to have 2 times whatever their utility of this endowment is. And for men, because men also have assets, men are going to eat the endowment in the first period, and in the second period they couldn't do anything with the assets, so they're just going to eat it in the second period. If you get into a relationship, whether that's non-marital fertility or marriage, we're going to have 2 times child quality, because now you've had a child, which depends on the endowments as well as the investment tau. In the first period, you're going to have your consumption that's going to depend on your endowments, because as long as you're together with your partner, you're going to share resources, so it's going to depend on both his and hers endowment. And then you're going to have this expected second period consumption, and this is what I need to get into a little bit more. This is the second period is just an expectation, because what's the key source of uncertainty? It's that you don't know if the relationship is going to last or not, okay? So if the relationship lasts, then you're going to just keep on sharing resources together. If the relationship doesn't last, then you're going to be sort of left with your own resources as well as whatever separation settlement you get. The separation settlement is going to have that income component, which is going to be child support, which might be similar between marriage and non-marital fertility, and it's going to have the division of the assets, which is only going to happen in the case of marriage, okay? So the woman has this optimization problem of how much am I willing to invest in children, and we're going to model this as being about her time. So basically, she has 2 pots she can put her time into. She can put it into her career, or she can put it into her children. Any amount that she puts into her children means that when she gets to the second period, she didn't make those career investments, so it's going to take away from her second period earnings, right? Because she didn't invest in her career, she invested in her children instead, okay? So it's going to lower her own second period income. Not such a problem as long as you're staying together with your partner, because you pool his income and your income and you divide it back out again, right? But if you end up separated in that second period, big problem, because you don't have his income anymore, you just have your own income, and if you made a really big investment in children, let's say you put 100% of your time into children, you're left with a much lower income in the second period, okay? So her optimization problem is that she needs however much her time improves child quality to be equal to the cost of investing that time, which is however it decreases second period utility. So that's that U tilde second period utility. So just marginal cost has to equal marginal benefit, but it's the private benefit to her, okay? So it has this 1/2 here because we get 2 periods of child quality. So basically you're paying the cost once, you're getting the benefit twice, so we need the benefit to equal twice the cost. But if we looked at how did it affect her and her husband together, we would have a 4 down here, because he also gets 2 periods of child quality, right? So she gets 2 periods of child quality, he gets 2 periods of child quality. So it's a public goods problem in that in the absence of, really secure contracting, she's going to really want to underinvest, okay? If they were able to perfectly stay together in the second period, then the cost would be shared between them. It would be divided, because it's all going to be pooled into that joint pot and divided back out, right? But because there's this weighted average between a scenario where they stay together and a scenario where they break up, and if they break up, she's left holding the bag, she's left paying the entire cost, she's going to want to underinvest, okay? So the key thing that we're going to need for our other results of what do assets do for marriage is that she's going to underinvest in child quality, okay? And just a second for the economist to have some technical details here. So if I'm going to say that they divide resources according to a sharing rule beta, where she gets beta of resources, which might be less than 1/2, okay? If beta is very, very small, because she gets such a small share of resources, you might think she's going to underinvest anyway, she's going to be tempted to overinvest because she's paying a small portion of the cost because she's getting beta share of the resources. With concave utility, that's not too much of a problem, because even though she's getting such a small share of the resources, her marginal utility of consumption is super high, right? So in the paper we have some conditions on beta that make sure that she's always going to want to underinvest and it's not too burdensome. If you imagined it with beta being 1/2, it's super easy, but if beta is less than 1/2, if you say, look, she was never going to get half the resources anyway, then you need to put some conditions on it. Yeah.
Just to follow up on what you're saying now, you had an assumption which is empirically true that the women on average make less than the men. And I grant that you're substituting some income for. But what if you lived in a regime in which women were making more than men? In what circumstances would marriages be contracted under this model?
So I put in the assumption that women make slightly less than men, because it makes it really easy to say if somebody has to invest tau, it should be her that invests tau, right?
I get that,
That's why if you build in some other structure, which is just like women are the ones who have to be pregnant and breastfeed, even if she earns more, she might still have to be the one to put in at least some of the tau, right? So it's basically, this is sort of going to apply to any regime where the woman is putting in more of the tau, or if you want to put it this way, one partner is putting in more of the tau. They're going to need that security. If there is a regime where they're able to perfectly share the tau, then this is less applicable. And so one actually suggestion of the model is that because marriage is becoming less and less secure, you're going to be less optimally able to do division of labor, because the person who's dividing the labor and choosing to invest in the home while somebody is investing in the labor force isn't guaranteed that financial security. So the fact that men do put more into these home investments now would actually be one implication of the model, that you're less able to securely contract over division of labor, so you don't do it. And you'll see it in our empirical results as well. Okay, so then the question is, what do assets do? So remember this, going back to how she makes this decision, she's going to set the cost of her investments in children the benefits of her investment in children equal to the costs. So anything that lessens the impact of tau on second period utility is going to make her willing to put more tau in over here, right? So anything that reduces this is going to make her willing to say, okay, so I'm going to be willing to put more tau into child quality. So assets are going to reduce the impact of her time investment on her second period consumption. And they're going to do that through two channels, okay? The first channel is that because we have concave utility, and she knows she's going to be left with this asset settlement in the second period, she's going to be on a flatter part of her utility function, meaning that the reduction in her own income matters less, right? So because she has something to consume, she knows she's going to be able to eat in the second period, she doesn't have to worry about, oh, am I making $50 an hour, or am I making $60 an hour as much? Because she's already got some baseline consumption there. So that's the consumption insurance channel, okay? That's the first channel. The second channel is that because he's anteing up the assets, and versus a world where he gets to sort of maintain control of his assets, if he gets divorced, they get divided in half, it's going to provide a disincentive to divorce, okay? So, and because we're going to have a disincentive to divorce, we're going to shift weight away from the scenario where she's left paying for the investment herself towards the scenario where she's able to share the cost of the investment. So those two things are going to reduce the impact of tau on her second period consumption, meaning she's going to be willing to put more tau in. So the economics condition is that her second period utility is super modular in assets and tau. So the more assets there are, the less tau affects her second period consumption. Any questions on that? So that's the key thing that we need for this, for all of this to go through, is that we need, starting with investment in children is too low, right? Everybody would like it to be higher. And then if you have assets, it will be higher. That's going to give us that people with assets are going to want to marry more. Because the value of marriage that's being weighed against whatever costs you have to pay to get married, and that's the cost of getting married in the first place, getting divorced if it doesn't work out, right? There's some reason that marriage is costly. You're going to get more value from marriage if you have more investment in children, because that's, sort of part of what people are valuing in their utility function here. So if assets raise her investment in children, assets raise the value of marriage. So conditional on endowment, couples with assets are going to get more value out of marriage, are going to be more likely to marry. Yes?
So it's crucial that the like not necessarily in the model, but in your way of thinking of it, that the house is basically illiquid and immobile, so it's visible assets rather than assets that could potentially be hidden.
Yeah, I think it's important that it's like, it's pretty secure that she's going to get it, right? So his bank account might be less appealing because you might think, oh, if the relationship starts to break down, you're going to start hiding that money, right? Or you're going to start spending it on things that I don't like motorcycles, right? So that's, yeah, I think you want it to be something that's like, it's sitting here as a promise, right?
So, but also you should see the idea for like a wealthy couple is that they have, the husband and wife get similar utility in both periods from the investment in the child. So, but if he or she plays different normative values on having children, then you would expect marriage to be less likely in that couple because he stands to lose more if he invests in marriage.
Yes, that's right. So you might think people who, if there are some husbands that value, or potential husbands who value children less, then they're going to be less willing to sort of put their asset at risk. And I think you really picked up on something that's really key, which is that ex post, once divorce happens and he loses his asset, he's not thrilled about that, right? But ex ante, going into it, he's glad that he has the opportunity to secure the marriage via putting up his house, anteing up the house, right? Because that's what enables him to get this tremendous value of his wife's contributions to child human capital. So he's like, so people say like, well, why don't people just have prenups? Actually, this kind of explains why prenups are so uncommon in the US, and where they do exist, they almost always still guarantee some asset settlement to the wife. And the reason is because he doesn't want the contract to protect his assets, because if it did, it wouldn't be secured. It wouldn't be a collateralized contract. He wants his assets to be at risk in the contract. Yes?
Do you assume that at time of marriage there are differential assets between men and women?
So it just sort of doesn't.
I wonder what produces this, because if education is equal and premarital labor experience is equal and inheritance is equal, so what produces, except for age gaps or some other things?
I think a big part of it is age gaps. So I think what we see is that men tend to work first to sort of build up a.
Small if men are.
All you have to be able to do is put down the down payment. And then here's the point, is that all you have to, like, we don't have this in the model because it would just complicate things, but to tell you what I actually think is going on, all you have to do is put down the down payment. And if you put down the down payment, and then let's say she's taking 10 years off to be with the children and he's working for those 10 years, every payment that he's making, if you put down the down payment, is going into a joint asset. So in fact, the asset can actually be being acquired during marriage, but it's during this period where marriages very rarely break up, during this period where there are very young children at home. And it's only once the marriage becomes really risky, when the children start being a bit older, you need to make sure you have the asset acquired by then. So it's about converting his income, which you can't control and you can't monitor, right? It's converting that income into this very solid, guaranteed asset that's going to be divided upon divorce. So his salary, another way of putting it is like his salary, you can look at that and say, as long as we have the down payment, I know your salary is mortgage payments, which is going to guarantee some security for me. Whereas if we don't have the down payment, then I can't, that salary can just sort of evaporate, right? Yeah?
Is the ordering of these events important for your model? Marriage, purchasing a house, and then fertility, or what happens if it doesn't happen quite in that order? How will you deal with investments prior to?
I think the model suggests there's a reason that things do happen in this order. So that what we see is that people marry, purchase a home, and then have children. And I think it's a great point, because I can actually make a chart out of that. And it's amazing how consistent people are with that order. And this model suggests it's not a coincidence. Why don't you marry, have the child, and then buy the house, right? But that's not what people do. It's marry, get the house so you have that security to offer. That's when she's going to be willing to start investing in children. Then you have children. Okay, so just two more propositions that come out of the model are that we're going to have two big historical changes that have happened in the last 50 years. The first is that we switched from a regime that was bilateral divorce to one that was unilateral divorce. So bilateral divorce meant that both people had to go to the court and say, yes, I want to get divorced. How did that work in practice? I'm going to take Mad Men as historical fact. There was this episode where Roger Sterling was like, Jane, I want a divorce. And she said, okay, but it's going to cost you. For her to go to the court and say, yes, I also want a divorce, she needed to receive a giant check first, right? So that offered offered some security because given that she had property rights over the right to stay married, she knew she was guaranteed to walk away with something if he wanted to get a divorce. As soon as you switch to unilateral divorce, that security goes away because now he can just say, I want a divorce, I'm going to the court today and I'm filing, and she has no right to say no, okay? So what our model suggests is that when you have bilateral divorce, this do you have a home or not distinction is going to be less important because he's required to bribe her if he wants a divorce. He's required to write a check. But once you take away that legal protection, you have unilateral divorce, this asset, no asset distinction becomes extremely important. And so this is a proposition I'm going to be able to take the data to show you that as we switch to unilateral divorce, it's going to affect people with and without assets differently. The second big legal change is that we took cohabitation, which used to have almost no contracting attached to it, and moved it closer to the marriage contract. And the way that happened was through child support enforcement. So, marriage has both income sharing and asset sharing, and basically this paternity enforcement movement that happened in the 90s created income sharing outside of marriage. So that meant, look, you guys are together and you're in love now, you have a child, but what if you break up? Even if you're not married, he still has to pay to support the child, okay? And what I'm gonna show you both in the data and in simulations from the model is that that's gonna create a huge movement away from marriage because suddenly cohabitation is a really good substitute for the marriage contract because it offers this income security unless you're able to have a house, in which case it's not nearly as good of a contract because it doesn't actually put the house at risk. So those are the propositions from the model. We are done with that part. And now I can show you what this looks like in the data. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Question. So if you buy a house and then you divorce 1 year later, the equity you have in the house is very small, right? So what happens in that case?
I mean, her investments are also very small. So like, if you divorce 1 year later, she hasn't, by definition, she hasn't taken off very much time to spend a lot of time with her children, right? So,
you get married, then you have a kid 1 year later, and after 2 years, you divorce. Then you should really spend 2 years with the baby, but the house is still a mortgage. So what happens? Does the husband have to pay for the entire mortgage, or
no? So if legally, it's just whatever equity you have in the home is going to be divided, right? So I think my idea is that in general, the acquisition of the equity sort of goes along in the same time frame as her investment. So as she's investing more, you're building up more equity each year, right?
But it's true that the marriage is still very risky. As long as the house is
mostly right. And you know what is even more fun than that is that when you have the introduction of this ability to take reverse mortgages and take equity out of your house, right, it suggests that you're going to have a lot of intra-household disagreement about that because it's going to really expose, let's say the wife has already made her investment, so the husband doesn't have a need to have this big collateral standing there anymore. He would be more keen to take a reverse mortgage and get the equity out of the house than she would be. So I think there's some potential for empirical identification using some of that, which we haven't done yet. Yeah.
Let's take his point to a different level, different time period. Once the house is paid off, it doesn't change as an asset. Doesn't that reduce her incentive to invest more in kids? Wouldn't that move her back to trying to save more money?
As long as it's not changing anymore, but our model doesn't have it changing. I just described that you're sort of acquiring it over time because I think that's realistic in terms of what happens. All the model requires is that it's there because that reduces the impact, it reduces the cost to her of investing in children. So it doesn't, she's incentivized to invest more in children in the sense that it's less costly to her to invest in children because as long as the house is there, she's guaranteed she's not going to be left with sort of nothing to eat.
But his point, and your response to his point, was that the size of that asset, it's not a physical house. House is not the same. It's how much equity you got in the house. So,
but it doesn't need to change.
Increases as it changes. But once it's set, she has no further incentive.
No, so that's the piece that's not quite right because as long as it's there, it's true that in terms of how much of an incentive is it, right? It's not increasing anymore, but it's still staying flat at that level of it's having this impact that's in the model. As long it's not going back down to zero, right? It's staying, it's there, it's this asset. So in the model, it's just a stationary, like it's an asset and it doesn't grow. So as long as you have it, right, what would be different is if you then started removing from it and taking away from it. But the general life cycle of marriage is that like when she's making these investments in general, is the same period. Each year that you're expecting her to sort of continue investing is another period you're building up more equity in the house. And I just described it that way because that's what I think is actually happening. Okay, so I'm going to show you the empirical test, and then I want to save some time for a little bit of a discussion of what the implications are of this. So our main empirical test is that we actually use variation in whether people are able to acquire homes at the time of marriage in order to see whether it's true that if you are able to acquire a home, do you invest more in children? Because so I already showed you there's an association between asset holding and marriage. So now what I want to know is does it look like it's coming through this channel of really investing in children? So we use idiosyncratic variation in the housing price. I'm going to do this at the state level right now. So I'm going to look at how high were house prices in the state that you got married in the year that you got married. Okay. I'm sorry, we don't have state of marriage. It's a unfortunate quirk of the data set. So we have either current state or state of birth. It works if we do it with both, and we assume you got married in sort of one of those, right? Or at least the majority of the time you did. So we're going to look at how expensive were houses in the year that you got married in your state relative to the general housing price index and relative to the housing price index in your state today. So we can control for this current economic environment to make sure this isn't sort of economic effects of what's happening right now. But the point is, if you were just facing a super expensive housing market the year you got married, you were more likely to be like, you know what, sweetie, let's stay renters for right now, right? Whereas if you were facing a really cheap housing market, then you could easily buy a house. And the reason you might be constrained by that is that there's this down payment requirement that you have to have a 20% down payment, okay? So I'm doing this at the state at the state level. In the paper, we do a whole bunch of robustness checks, which include dropping the financial crisis, using the MSA level data instead of using the state level data, and using state of birth instead of using current state in case you moved and you got married in the state of birth rather than in the state that you live in. So what we're going to look at is I'm first going to show you there's a first stage that yes, if you were facing super high housing prices in the year that you got married, you're less likely to be a homeowner today, right? So this is looking retrospectively in this data, and I say I have data from 2008 to 2014. I look at what year you got married, and maybe it's in 1995, right? The fact that you faced a really high housing prices in 1995 mean you're less likely to be a homeowner today, okay? So that's the first stage. So this does have bite in terms of decreasing your home ownership. So now I'm going to look at whether it actually impacts your child investments. So the first way of measuring this is I'm going to look at children, okay, and see what their outcomes are. So I have grade retention, which is whether the child was held back in school. People who were facing idiosyncratically high housing prices in the year that they got married are more likely to have their children held back in school, so lower child investment. They also have fewer children. So if she's making that calculation of how many kids am I willing to have, because each kid is going to be another couple years where I'm not able to invest in the labor market, high housing prices mean fewer children, okay? A caveat, yeah?
Wasn't that just space concerns?
So a caveat of this is there could be two direct effects of homeownership on the second thing. The first could be that if you're a homeowner, you have more space, and so there's like sort of a direct impact of like real estate is complementary with the consumption of children, right? That it's easier to have more children if you have a bigger space. So there's that. And then the second concern is that you could imagine it's possible that there are income effects from having idiosyncratically low housing prices at the time you buy into the market, and then the house is going to appreciate, and we know that you might have positive income effects on fertility, right? So next, to sort of rule out that that's what's driving these results, I'm going to look directly at labor force outcomes. And the reason this is going to be helpful is because, of course, there might be income effects also on labor force outcomes, but my model predicts that men and women are going to be impacted in opposite directions. So the model predicts that the more you're able to acquire real estate at the time you get married, the more division of labor you're able to have. He can work more, and she's going to work less because she's going to be putting that time into children, okay? And so if it were an income effect, it should go in the same direction for both people. And so what we see is that when we have HPI interacted with this female dummy, the higher were housing prices in the year you got married, meaning the less likely you are to own a home, the more likely she is to have worked last year relative to him, and the more hours she works relative to him. So this is less division of labor that's happening in the household because they weren't able to get a home. So basically she's saying, look, if there's not real estate, I can't afford to take time off of my job because I need to protect myself by making sure I'm still investing. And the impact on him is the opposite. The impact on him is, well, if she's not investing as much in the children, then I am not able to lean in as much in my job, and that's why the impact on men is actually negative here. You could imagine that is, right? It could be from some other factor, but we have a negative impact on men and a positive interaction with women. So that's the sort of static results of saying what does the situation look like today by looking at our direct story. And now I'm going to look at those policy. Stop working. I'm now gonna, this last result, which is that it also means you're less likely to get divorced. So the more likely you are to own a home, that channel of it disincentivizes divorce, it appears to be active, you're less likely to get divorced. Okay, so now I'm gonna look at those two policy changes. Yes?
People move to states where housing prices are low. So if some people anticipate this, I guess mobility would be on the horizon. So you don't you live in San Francisco, you can't buy a house, so you move somewhere else where you can.
I think that's why it's important it works for state of birth too. So because state of birth might be an instrument for where you get married, it's going to be imperfect, but it's going to take out any selection of you being able to chase low housing prices because you can't get married where you can't determine where you were born. But yeah, I'll think about it a little bit if it could affect those other results. Thanks. Okay, so I'm now going to look at those two policy changes. So the first is a switch from bilateral divorce to unilateral divorce, and then the second being the paternity establishment laws. So to go from bilateral to unilateral, I use the PSID because I need panel data that has assets and marriage, and I need coverage in the 70s because that's when these divorce laws changed. Unfortunately, the PSID is a pretty small data set to actually look at this in, so you're going to see I'm a little bit underpowered, but nonetheless the result is there. So unilateral divorce, this sign is negative, it decreases marriage, but the sign is the opposite for people with assets. So unilateral divorce causes people to get less value for marriage because the contract is less secure. But people with assets are still able to harvest some of that value for marriage, and they're not affected by this movement towards unilateral divorce. And so this is their impact on them being ever married over the sample period. I can also look at time to marriage, and it shows that the people with assets get married sooner relative to people without assets, even when unilateral divorce comes in. Does everybody understand the argument of why unilateral divorce would decrease? Everyone's okay, good. All right, so then the second policy change that I look at is the introduction of these paternity establishment laws. So these are the laws that said that if you are a father who isn't married to the mother, you're still responsible for paying child support. And the best variation on this comes from work by Maya, Ross, and Slater, and it's using the rollout of these programs where they basically showed up when you were at the hospital because the father is actually, even if they've broken up or something, the father's really likely to be at the hospital, and everybody's happy and in a good mood, so they go, are you the dad? Sign this. So it's called in-hospital voluntary paternity establishment, and it's the biggest it's the biggest booster of child support enforcement because you basically have on paper this person is the dad, okay? So this has already been shown to reduce marriage. That wasn't the idea of the policy. The idea of the policy was to increase child investments. Why would it increase child investments? Well, because you're going to get these fathers who might have been very marginally involved before, you're going to get them to declare that they're the dad, and you're going to enforce that they pay child support. But if you think about the economic contract, you've just provided a substitute for the marriage contract. And so it turned out that some of these people, in the absence of the ability to have this little bit of contracting, they would have decided to enter into a marriage contract. But they now don't enter into a marriage contract. They choose this sort of lower level contract because it provides the benefits that they need. If you don't have a house, you don't get extra security through the marriage contract, so this contract works just as well. So what's already there in the literature is that we know that this reduces marriage. What I'm going to show you is that it doesn't for people who have assets. So this has no impact on people who have assets. So it reduces marriage in general because people say, hey, this substitute contract is just as good. But for people with assets, the marriage contract is still far superior because it's a much stronger contract that's going to get them much bigger child investments. And so we see the sort of opposite impact, the same with the unilateral divorce laws. And this is true for both rates of ever getting married as well as this other metric of time to marriage. And so I do this in the SIP because I need coverage in the 90s, which is when these laws changed and the PSID doesn't have the coverage in the 90s. That's why 2 different data sets here. Any questions on those empirical results? Okay, so I'm going to show you, I'm going to wrap up by kind of summarizing what I showed you, and then I'm going to show you a simulation of the model because I think it kind of tells you why this might be important from a policy perspective. So just to summarize what I showed you, a model where assets can be anteed up as sort of put at risk deliberately to collateralize the contract produces predictions that are consistent with those empirical patterns I showed you at the beginning and in our PNP paper, which is that conditional on a lot of factors, assets are a big determinant of marriage, and that home ownership is intimately tied to marriage as a, you get married and you get the home. The reason is that assets provide commitment that allow for greater specialization in the household. So assets reduce the sort of public goods problem. They help solve the public goods problem. And you might think, the model leaves out a lot of things like what you brought up, that the house might just be really good anyway for having children. And we did that on purpose because we wanted to show you that even if assets don't actually directly go into child quality or they don't have any other benefits, assets have a huge impact on child quality through this contracting channel. So we kind of deliberately stripped it down to that one role of assets. Another thing that we've done in the paper is that we've had a model where instead of just having 2 periods, you have 3 periods. And this kind of goes to your point of like, how do you acquire the assets and when? And so we have a distribution of the likelihood of you sort of earning an asset through your labor. And what we find is that you end up with this bifurcation where people who are going to choose non-marital fertility might as well do it early because there's no point in waiting. And the people who have a good chance of earning an asset wait and they get married later. And that matches really well with the data because we've seen simultaneously a movement towards younger first motherhood and a movement towards older first marriage. And so, the model suggests it might be because people know the marriage is going to be more valuable if I can secure it. So if I have a chance of being in the married group, I want to wait to be able to sort of nail down the marriage. Empirically, I showed you when there were idiosyncratically high home prices, we saw that directly lowered home ownership, and thus, hopefully through the channels of our model, it led to lower investment in children, less specialization, and more divorce. And then those 2 policy experiments, when you introduce unilateral divorce and you introduce this substitute contract of paternity establishment, we find that the impact is concentrated on people without assets rather than people with assets. So what I want to end on is kind of talking about the policy implications of this. And I think, so I'm going to show you a simulation from the model because I want to suggest that the potential implications of this are not small. So this is, don't take it too seriously, it's a stylized model and we simulated it, but we played around with what happens if you kind of ramp up this non-marital transfer that you're going to get through paternity establishment, and we make it more similar towards the child support that you're going to get in marriage, okay? So the idea is once the marriage breaks up, you're going to get some kind of an income transfer. It's not going to be nearly as good as if you stayed together, but you're going to get some kind of an income transfer. So starting over here on the left, this is where you're not going to get any kind of an income transfer, okay? If you break up and you have a relationship that's not marriage, you're not going to get a transfer, whereas if you're married, you're going to get a transfer. What we see is that people with assets all pretty much get married. They really prefer the marriage contract, has a lot more security to them. But people with no assets, they're kind of split. More of them get married than who don't get married, okay? The middle picture is that I take that non-marital transfer and I make it 1/3 of the marriage transfer. So this is basically saying child support enforcement outside of marriage is 30% as good as it is within marriage, okay? And what you see is that the people without assets are hardly affected at all. We just see the littlest bit of non-marital fertility here. But the people without assets, now really prefer non-marital fertility. Okay, the third picture is that I take that non-marital transfer and I make it 2/3 as good as marriage. So it's still not 100%. It's still not 100% as strong as marriage, but I say, let's assume child support enforcement is 2/3 as good outside of marriage as within marriage. Now the people without assets 100% prefer non-marital fertility to marriage. And so by making a legal change like that, and the people with assets, by the way, are still almost unaffected. So this is a legal change like that you would never think paternity enforcement is going to increase inequality, but it just increased inequality. Because by making this paternity enforcement happen outside of marriage, you've completely changed the way that people choose to enter into relationships. All those people without assets are choosing non-marital fertility, and what do we know about it? We know their children are going to get less investments because it's a less secure contract, right? And we know all the literature that shows us that those children are going to fare less well through this non-marital fertility than through this marital fertility. What this also suggests is that this fundamental wealth inequality is tremendously important in society, because the people who have wealth, they don't need this external legal structure that's encouraging marriage, because they have assets that are going to secure the marriage contract, right? But that also means that this isn't going to be self-correcting. It can basically create a poverty trap, because if you don't have wealth in the first place, now you can't secure the marriage contract, you can't get these optimal child investments, so you choose non-marital fertility. Well, that means you're investing less in the next generation, so they're not going to have the advantages that are going to allow them to go out and acquire wealth, that are going to allow them to be able to get married and invest more in their children. And so just starting out with that wealth inequality in the beginning creates this inequality in child investments. And again, I don't need to put preferences in here, I don't need to put different values or culture or some of the things that people say are responsible for this marriage gap. I just have to put in this fundamental economic inequality of some people have wealth and some people don't have wealth. So, and when you look at some of the things that people have said are drivers of the marriage gap, so one thing is there's a really large race gap in marriage that has been unexplained, that people say it's too large, you know, we know there's a gradient by income, but it's too large to just be driven by the income gap. Well, the black-white wealth gap is enormously larger than the black-white income gap, and the homeownership gap might be even larger than that, because we know we had redlining and mortgage discrimination. And this paper tells you that when you discriminate against somebody for getting a mortgage, you're having a much bigger impact. Obviously, the impact is large anyway, but now you're affecting not just where they live, but what kind of relationship they're able to get into and how much they're able to invest in their children. So that means for kind of looking forward into the policies, wealth inequality has huge implications that go beyond sort of just the implications for the current generation, but that actually impact how much you might be able to invest in the next generation. And access to credit and home ownership actually as a policy reaches far beyond sort of a policy of affecting where people live, but actually reaches into, you know, child human capital investment, et cetera. So we have a couple minutes left, so I can take some questions if there are more. Yes?
Yeah, you're hanging all of this, I mean, this is very impressive, thank you. But you're hanging your argument on the idea that if you're not married, you can't make a credible contract on the buying of a home.
No, that's not right.
No?
If you're not married, you can't guarantee that the home is going to be divided when the relationship goes sour.
Why can't you do that with a contract?
It's uncommon.
Basically, the cheapest way to do that is the marriage contract, because you have to sign over your assets over to the other person, right? So the marriage contract says anything, and it might even be an asset you don't have yet. So that's the point over here, that you're like, the marriage contract says every penny you put towards this home, 50-50, it's mine, right? It's a very cheap contract for actually achieving something that is like very nuanced from a legal perspective. It's everything you acquire while we're married, I have a claim onto it, because the marriage contract presumes that you have divided labor and she's providing services in the home while you're providing services at work, and it would be very hard to contract over that rock solid.
If you buy a home together, it's not presumed they're equal owners.
If you buy a home together and you both are making equal mortgage payments, but if he's paying the mortgage while she's staying home with children, if you're not married, she doesn't get half of it. Yeah, that's a good question. Anything else?
I was just curious about the comparative static, i.e. with other countries. So, you know, the
I forgot that bullet point.
Is much less likely to get married in the United Kingdom and in France than we are in the United States. And so, you know, one policy that they think drives that is, first of all, the lengthy guarantee of women's jobs after they give birth. So
Yeah.
like a year, you
Yes.
keep a job for a year. And the other thing is that with the bigger social safety net and
It's a substitute for the insurance through marriage, yes.
right. Okay. So I guess then another question for the U.S. states is, do you see these differences in states that have like a better health system that's not based on the same types of entitlements that they are in other states? So where So where your health insurance, for example, is not tied to employment.
That's a great question. So we haven't done that within state, and we have this cross-country thing in the back of our mind as something that we're going to do next. We haven't explored that either, but I think we were thinking, okay, if you look at the legal environment, we should be able to explain some of the cross-country variation in if the retreat from marriage looks different exactly in different places, then it's suggestive that the legal structure is also likely different. So either it's because the social safety net substitutes for that insurance through marriage, so you don't need it as much, or it could be because you have higher socioeconomic status people who still aren't able to acquire homes because housing prices are so much higher. So you have that in Europe where like a lot of the middle class doesn't own homes versus the US, right? So I think definitely looking cross-country is kind of on our agenda for the future, but I hadn't thought of doing the state thing, so that's interesting.
Corinne, that was, well, you know, a good theory explains a lot of things, and you've explained a lot of things. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.